Hello, you're listening to Radio Maria, and I'm delighted to welcome on the Friarside today Matthew Harvey Sanders. If you were listening to the panel on AI from Farm Street yesterday, you will have heard him there. But Matthew's a former infantry officer from Canada, a seminarian for a period, then discerning a call to married life, worked in the Canadian Civil Service, and then for Cardinal Collins of Toronto. And the reason we've got him on today is he's the founder of Longbeard and Magisterium AI, and sort of with that sort of cap on, he's also worked for the Dicastery for promoting integral human development. So a very warm welcome to the studio to you, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I wanted to start off with, I think it surprised everyone when Pope Leo sort of took his name. There were some people going, oh, you know, rerum novarum, he's going to be against capitalism. And there are sort of the Dominicans amongst us going, Eterni Patris, he's a revival of Thomism. And then he said, I think as a little bit of a surprise to most people, I chose to take the name Leo XIV. There are different reasons for this, but mainly because Pope Leo XIII, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. What did you make of that?
Well, I mean, when these statements first came out, I was a little bit surprised, I mean, pleasantly, and I knew that he was an American, right? So I figured, you know, he'd probably at least be following American news, and AI has been kind of a hot topic lately. And I saw an Catholic influencer I follow named Sachin Joseph said that he'd followed his channel back when he was Cardinal Prevost. So, anyways, this is a guy. You know, I also knew he was a mathematician and things. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't surprised that he knew about artificial intelligence and the implications it has for our world. But the fact that he decided this is going to be one of the most important issues defining his papacy, at least that's what he seems to be signaling right now, that was quite remarkable to me. Because, I mean, a lot of us who work in the AI industry, what we're concerned about is people don't understand, or they underhype the long-term implications of the technologies. I think in many ways it's going to be far more transportive than we can even imagine. So, and I think that this in many ways could be a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing if people don't have the right intellectual, spiritual, and human formation. And so hearing him say that gives me a lot of hope, because it makes me think that he's aware of the implications of this technology, long-term, these significant impacts, and that he's going to dedicate at least part of his pontificate to ensuring that humanity is shepherded through this important time, as it has been in the past. Yeah,
so that frame of AI as being akin to a new industrial revolution in terms of its implications, that's not an exaggeration in your mind. That's something that's real in its implications for the future and the way that we live.
Yeah, I mean totally. I mean, actually, I would probably say, be bold enough to say that this is probably the most profound revolution we're about to go through when it comes from like a technological perspective. I mean, the former CEO, or the current CEO of Google, had said that he considers this technology to be more profound than electricity and fire, right? I mean, which is, it sounds absurd, but I think it's true. Like, we're talking about thinking machines here, right? And then we're talking about thinking machines which aren't just these disembodied things living in, supercomputers, but are going to be embodied in robots producing, walking amongst us. So it's it's huge. And again, I think for the Pope, who he spent a lot of time working in other parts of the world, and he could see very, very clearly that for many, they live still on the peripheries, and in many ways are subject to a lot of these huge economic and changes that happen in the world and things. I think he sees that there's a chance here that these people will be left out of this transition. And so what I'm hoping he'll do is he'll be a great champion for them, and will encourage countries as they're thinking about accommodating these technologies, in many ways trying to accelerate them, that they won't forget about the peripheries, and work to ensure that the technology benefits all.
So if we step back for a moment then, and some of our listeners will have thought a lot about AI, I know, and we've had questions of faith about it, and I've received private messages, but for other people, AI just sounds like a really powerful search engine, like sort of Google on steroids. What actually is the difference between AI and sort of doing a Google search? You know, it could appear that it's just a neater way of presenting what's found, but is there a more profound difference than that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, I think it, like in the past, when we built these kind of technologies, I mean, human beings had to program them, right? So if this, then that was kind of like the logic that was kind of programmed into them. But, you know, what we're building today is different. You know, I like to tell people that, you know, the artificial intelligence is, you know, basically the ChatGPTs and, you know, the Geminis, as we're here in England, in London, the home of DeepMind. We grow these things. We don't really build them, right? We set the conditions for their emergence, and they emerge. And so in many ways, these technologies, I mean, they're still passive for the most part. We have to prompt them. But what goes on under the hood is incredibly sophisticated, and we don't direct that. Like the AIs to really direct themselves. And so in many ways, they're becoming, you know, more and more, they operate more and more like the human brain would. And so it is profoundly different, especially as we're entering this new age of agents, right? Where we simply will give them a task, and they will go out and basically set objectives, and they'll go and search the internet, gather information, you know, reason through it, and come back to us, ask for further direction, and so on and so on. And, you know, I think these agents will have a profound impact in the world. And I think, you know, in many ways, the agency has always been really just the purview of human beings. Now we're starting to see that there's going to be these machine agents that will be working alongside us. So this is a very different paradigm than the past.
Yeah. And then thinking about sort of machine learning and intelligence, is AI actually intelligent in your mind, or it's just a simulacrum of intelligence?
I think it is, but it's not in a human way. It's certainly an alien form of intelligence, but certainly there's a lot of distilled intelligence inside of the large language models, you know, parameters. A lot more than I think we even realize. And I think that the reason why we sometimes underappreciate the intelligence of these things is because we have to extract their intelligence through prompts, basically, right? But within their parameters is immense. I mean, we're talking like everything that human beings have ever written. So let's say that adds up to something like 20 trillion tokens, which is, you know, like 10 trillion words. All of that knowledge is compressed inside of their brains. Now, for a long time, we just thought they were just, you know, pattern matching machines, right? You submit a prompt, you know, it vectorizes that, converts that into a mathematical expression, and just runs it against, you know, what it knows, and just spits back out patterns that it thinks are the most, you know, statistically relevant to answering that query. But there's more going on there. We're realizing now there's some, you know, cutting edge research from Anthropic, which is demonstrating that these large language models are thinking before they actually answer. The way they understand concepts, although it's, you know, it's different than human brains, there's some parallels, right? So they understand concepts about the world, and then what they do is when someone prompts them and asks them a question in a particular language, they map language onto those concepts, which is quite remarkable. And again, this is stuff we're just starting to figure out about artificial intelligence. There's a new field that's emerging called mechanistic interpretability, which is basically trying to figure out how the large language models think and reason through things. And the more we learn about these large language models, the more we start to see these crazy parallels with our own brains. And of course, so as we continue to scale these things up and make them more and more powerful, I think you're going to see more and more similarities in the way that they think and know.
So when you speak about the large language model and AI thinking, what's actually going on underneath the hood there when you use that word?
Sure. So let's take an example like Magisterium AI. So someone goes there and they write a prompt, right? They ask it a question. So what happens is that prompt is converted to like a mathematical expression of the intent of the search. So it's kind of like abstracting away from the text to capture the meaning of what that person's looking for. And Google search works the same way. I mean, like for instance, I mean, I've said this before. If you go to Google search and type in, what is the stock price for Apple? Yeah, I mean, how does it know you're talking about the company and not the fruit? And that's because it abstracts away and it understands the intent of the search. So that's the first part. So it creates this vector, which represents the intent of your search. And then that vector is then used to search a vector database of knowledge, right? And so for large language models, this would just be basically all the information compressed in its parameters inside of its brain. But they also sometimes will have access, like in the case of Magisterium AI, to a very large knowledge base of vectorized contents. In our case, it'd be like the totality of magisterial teaching ever written. And so basically that vector is used to search the vector database to see what documents are relevant, what patterns are relevant to answering this query. and they extract the relevant documents, and then they would feed it, to the large language model, which would then read over all of that context, right, including the prompt, and then basically what we're learning now is it will plan its answer, and then it will start generating its answer. So it'll understand it conceptually, understand where it wants to go with the answer, map it to language, and it'll start generating token by token the response. And of course, there's new techniques as well, called chains of thought, which is basically getting the LLM to think, in quotation marks, to think and reflect, to kind of reason out loud before it actually generates an answer. And this is thought to actually influence and improve the quality of its answers. What we're finding now in new research is actually that chain of thought may not actually be representative of the thinking going on in its head. That actually might just be it generating tokens, communicating to us what it thinks we would expect as far as thinking goes. So it's actually for our benefit, but actually the thinking that's going on is far more complex and abstracted away from that actual language. So there's something, very sophisticated going on. And so with large language models, you can think of them as pattern matching machines, but they're pattern matching machines which are capable of to some extent some limited planning, which is actually one of the hallmarks of intelligence. And let me just end with saying this final point. There are primarily 4 hallmarks of intelligence, at least understood in the AI field. So one is the ability to understand the world. So we call this like a world model, which we develop as babies, right? Which is understanding of physics and things like that. And another one would be the ability to kind of reason. Another one would be the ability to plan. And then a final one would be persistent memory. And so it was thought, I'd say even a year ago, that large language models are capable of none of those things. But what's interesting, and maybe it's just the more powerful models we're building now, is we're starting to see signs of at least 3 of those things in large language models. There's some understanding of the world. It's not a complete world model, obviously. There seems to be some planning going on, and now we start to understand there's some degree of reasoning going on. Now, they may be very basic forms, but that looks like there's signals of 3 of those 4 being ticked. Persistent memory, I think, is one that's still to be unlocked. And so, in many ways, I think these large language models are, in some ways, kind of disturbingly becoming more and more human-like. And I think this begs the question, if these things are some kind of intelligence, even though they may be an alien intelligence, what does that mean for us as human beings?
Yeah. So before we sort of get into the nuts and bolts of Magisterium AI, just a couple more questions on AI in general. I was thinking of the great Canadian philosopher of technology, Marshall McLuhan, and he said, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. What do you think are the risks? Because obviously with the computer started to come a slightly reductive understanding of the human person. Computer incredibly useful, but then in a almost like Kantian way, we started to see ourselves through the category of what a computer is capable of. What do you think are the risks with AI in that regard?
Well, there's many. I'm sure many of us heard the headlines, especially in the kind of the earlier generation of large language models that went popular, that some of them were quite biased, right? There was a lot of accusations that they were kind of woke, right? Particularly Google suffered from a lot of these accusations earlier on until DeepMind took over. And in many ways, our own experience of working with one of the early Google models was in fact the case. Like it would just refuse to answer certain questions about church teaching, and that's because the safety rails that were put in there were they were too broad. And so in some ways it concerns me because although these things have compressed basically everything that we've ever written, that data set reflects a great diversity of opinions, right? And so in some ways, I think we'd find a lot of the patterns of that data very disturbing. It's actually amazing to me that large language models. In large, this is not entirely by by coincidence. This is because there's a lot of effort that goes into something called post training to ensure that the LLMs know how to answer properly. But I'm surprised they're not more unhinged. Quite frankly, and in some ways that gives me great hope because it makes me think that the large language models, the patterns in the data, overwhelmingly net, I think are generally lean in a positive way, as opposed to overwhelmingly negative. But my biggest concern is that because these models are put together by labs, are post trained by labs. And then, of course, people start interacting with more and more and more, relying less on like Google search or showing up to a library and pulling books off the stacks. Is in some ways these large language models interact with them are going to start to shape our understanding of the world, right? And so if they're inherently biased or their training data, I mean, it is biased, that could be problematic. And so I think that there's a lot of effort with the labs right now to try and find ways to kind of determine or more clearly, or at least I should say, approach to training that focuses more on first understanding objective reality. And that the hope is with that is that the ALM will be more capable of discerning opinion from fact. I mean, to give you an example, Elon Musk's Grok large language model, for instance, he said that his training objective is basically it's truthfulness and then curiosity. The truthfulness is, that makes sense, right? They don't want LLMs lying because, I mean, this would, right now there's very robust safety standards they have in place to ensure that large language models are safe. But if the large language models are capable of lying, and they are, and as they get smarter, they're more capable of lying, this is very disturbing because it kind of invalidates all of those benchmarks. So this focus on ensuring the large language models are truthful is absolutely essential. Now, the curiosity one is interesting. His thought on that is that you want the large language model, and you want these, and once we get closer to AGI, you want the artificial general intelligence to be curious. Because you want to kind of see, I mean, you want it to be curious what human beings are going to be up to and what they're going to do, right? I mean, the thought is if they're not curious, it could, find us a bit of a menace, right? The energy they could be using, to think is being used by human beings to power their homes. And so we worry about these, so anyways, I do think ultimately that there is significant reasons to be concerned about people going to large language models for more and more of their information diets. And I do think ultimately the answer to this is to become less dependent on these closed model providers, like ChatGPT and Gemini, which work very closely with governments, at least in the past. I'm a big fan of open source for this reason. I don't like the idea that a few labs and a few governments are determining, what is true, what is not true, and what information I have access to, what I shouldn't. And so I think in open source, and Jan LeCun at Meta, for instance, who's Meta's chief AI scientist, is a big proponent of this, is that we want a diversity of models that are being trained. Right, that are because and that allows us to ensure that the models we're interacting with in some ways are aligned with our values. Or if we have some understanding of how they were trained, we may opt to use that model because of the way it was trained. And I think this ultimately is probably the safest way to ensure that way we don't live in some kind of dystopian world in the future.
Yeah, just a couple more questions before we, specifically on Magisterium AI. The first one I want to ask, what are and I think they're related, the risks that you think the Pope is identifying, say, from his experience working in the missions in Peru, about people on the peripheries being left behind, and what actually is driving the enormous amount of investment that is going into AI. Because your average person maybe listening to this program sort of thinks about it in terms of being able to maybe take a collection of notes. For example, our provincial, at our last provincial chapter, he said, well, I've just used AI to turn the meetings of the minutes of a meeting that we had into a little piece of prose to send to Santa Sabina about this, and he's done a very good job of it, and much quicker than he could have done. And that's great, and it's really useful. Or, I've gone sort of give me, four quotations from the scriptures on the teaching authority of the church. I know all those quotations, but it can find it much quicker than I can do. But that's not why hundreds of millions of dollars are being invested in these technologies to help students writing their essays and a priest find a few citations quicker.
I mean, no. I mean, I do think that, the heads of these labs, let's just say, again, we're in England, so Demis Hassabis, right, the head of DeepMind. I mean, I think, he's a father, and I think he's generally a good guy. And so he wants his kids to win, and he wants them to have access to high-quality education. And I think generally he wants every kid in the world to have access to a high-quality education. So I do think that for the most part, the guys heading up labs are good people, and so they want the best for humanity. But certainly, yeah, the investors that are behind them, I don't think their incentives are entirely philanthropic. They're hoping that this investment will pay massive dividends. I think when we talk about the peripheries, I think one of the things that the Pope is probably worried about is that AI. The interesting thing about AI is it's not just a threat to white collar work, right? So we're seeing more and more that AI is really becoming exceptional at medical diagnostics, right? We're starting to see that AI is being more and more used in the legal field. Now, these are considered to be white-collar professions. And AI is now becoming used more and more and more. But the other thing to remember is that there's also the embodied AI, right? We're robots. And these robots, I think, are kind of a threat to blue collar work, right? The factory work, and so for people in the peripheries who are working or their economy is overly dependent on manufacturing, and for the large part, that a lot of which they manufacture is exported. Obviously, the companies that are buying those exports want to buy them at the cheapest price possible, which means bringing down the costs as much as possible is just is going to be a very strong incentive for these companies to find to find cheaper ways to get things done. Which means probably investing in a robot for $25,000, right? Which can work 18-hour shifts, doesn't have a pension, and so on and so on. So, I think these are the kind of things that the Pope is worried about. And when we talk about the peripheries and the fringes, I think what we're really talking about is blue collar, right? The people that are most vulnerable to these changes, just ensuring that as these technologies are introduced, it's done in such a way that these people have something to turn to so that, their basic Maslow needs, aren't at risk. And I think this is important for just global stability, because if people fear that if these robots are, and again, the manufacturing these robots at scale is an incredibly technically difficult task, and it's going to take many years. But I think from many parts of the world, if this isn't handled properly, what you're going to find is some kind of violent reaction, as there has been in the past. And so finding ways to assure people. I think this is one of the important roles for the church in the future in shepherding humanity through this is to work with governments and make them know that we have a responsibility to ensure that these people have shelter, they have food, that their kids have access to high quality education and can be what they want to be. And I think if those concerns are addressed, I think that will address much of that fear, which could be very problematic and could lead to violent reactions. So these are some of the complicated questions I know some governments are starting to think about, but not enough. And I think that the Pope, as they were in the past with the Industrial Revolution, has a role to play prophetically, sharing with the governments its own perspective on how these technologies can implicate society, and basically advocate for the poor, so that basically there can be more robust civil conversation about this.
Fascinating. We're going to go to our first piece of music now, and I thought appropriate, given some of what we've been talking about, and particularly when you said about there seem to be things going on under the hood and kind of under the hood, thinking about the ghost in the machine. But I thought we'd listen to Holy Ghost Power by the Hillbilly Thomists, because I know we've both got a mutual friend in Father Thomas Joseph White. So this is Holy Ghost Power by the Hillbilly Thomists.
From the day I found out you were telling me lies, I've been living off of grits, whiskey, and moon pies, trying to find my place, launching prayers into space and staring into heaven at a bread that's unleavened. Nothing on the TV at 10. It's like Diet Coke and original sin. But don't be sad, it's just a world gone mad. You thought it was gold, but it's made out of tin. Now it's a zombie town, there's a lot of undead. They wander around looking underfed, and on their TV kitchens they watch the politicians who try to hypnotize with the conviction in their eyes. When my heart was broke, I thought life was a joke. It was just at that time he removed the yoke. He makes a rich man poor, he makes a weak man strong. No more going wrong just to get along. I felt the force of the truth when they pierced his side. I saw the war eagle dive and I could not hide. Just when I faced the capital hour, that's when I found the Holy Ghost power.
You are listening to Radio Maria, and that was Holy Ghost Power by the Hillbilly Thomas. I'm delighted to be joined today by Matthew Harvey Sanders, who is the founder of Longbeard and Magisterium AI. And Matthew's been giving us a bit of an introduction to what AI is and the uses of it and the potential sort of threats as identified by Pope Leo, who said that at least that it was a significant influence on him in choosing the name of Leo after Leo the 13th because of the profound implications for how AI might reshape our society in perhaps even a bigger way than the Industrial Revolution did. What I would like to get on to now is more specifically Longbeard and Magisterium AI, and first of all, why the name Longbeard? I was guessing at potentially maybe like Gandalf or something like that with wisdom, but I don't know. Why Longbeard?
I mean, I think that's partially true. I mean, when we founded the company, we were all kind of Catholics, and we were kind of coming together. I mean, really because we want to find ways to leverage technology to support the church and its mission. And so, the question was the company who's in service of. The easy answer was God. And then when it came to like naming it, we wanted to find some kind of subtle homage, and so we thought about the traditional God with the white beard thing.
Okay.
So yeah, that's one answer. The other answer is I should say there was also this kind of part of us that felt many of us had been working for religious orders and for archdiocese, and we kind of felt we were setting out on our own to try and figure out a way to serve the church. So there also was this kind of idea of the small pirate crew. Trying to do things differently and disrupt. And so, depending upon what market we used to speak to, we used to emphasize either the God in the white beard or the pirate angle.
Well, so like St. Paul, you can be all things to all men.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, nicely done there. And what is Magisterium AI then, and what sets it apart from other AI?
Yes, thank you for the question. So Magisterium AI is what we call a compound AI system. So basically what that means, it's a bunch of technologies that work together under the hood, essentially in order to ensure a faithful answer. According to the Magisterium of the Catholic Church. And so Magisterium AI is powered by large language models. What large language model it is kind of depends on what the state-of-the-art model is, but there's also other technologies involved. So it's powered by something called retrieval augmented generation, which is basically when you give, I think I mentioned this earlier, you have like a large knowledge base, let's say the entirety of a kind of church teaching, so Catholic, theological, philosophical thought, and then magisterial teaching, the fathers of the church, the Bible. You give the AI direct access to all those documents, and you basically tell it that when it's answering a question, it has to ground everything it's saying in source documents, or don't answer. And so that's a way of ensuring that the AI doesn't hallucinate or make something odd or get off the rails, which is a problem with conventional models when you're talking directly, because basically they're referencing everything in the internet inside of their brains. And so, they might be good 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, but they're never 10 out of 10. And so the idea with Magisterium AI is, could we build a truly faithful AI system that has a batting average? Okay, I'm getting my analogies mixed up here, but that basically is a 10 out of 10 on fidelity. And so our objective with Magisterium AI is to ensure for fidelity. So the other technologies also, one of the things we have to do, which has been a kind of a unique challenge, is there are certain texts within the Catholic Church which are complicated. Even like you think of like the liturgical A, B, and C. So what we found is that when you ask a large language model, what are the readings for B? It doesn't know, right? So we have to build these kind of unique tools in order to serve the right context to the models, and so it's able to answer certain questions accurately. And so we're always in this kind of quest to identify and build out new tools. The Roman Missal is another one we're building right now, another one for the Divine Office. So anyways, what we're hoping is that it can be kind of a single point of reference for kind of all things Catholic.
So where does the net extend? Like, how far do you cast your net, and how do you determine what comes within the net?
Sure. So, within Magisterium AI, there's kind of 2 separate silos within it. There's a magisterial teaching, and I should say, that includes extraordinary magisterial teaching and ordinary magisterial teaching. So, that which has been proclaimed by the church as formally extraordinary, like the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and then also the homilies of the popes, the general audiences, and so on and so on. And the reason we have included the ordinary magisterium is frankly AIs. They're getting better at this whole reasoning, basically generalizing, from first principles to particular, generalized context, but they're not great at it yet. So, for instance, when we launched Magisterium AI, I think we had initially on our pilot had like 600 magisterial documents in his knowledge base. So all the ones you'd expect, the Code of Canon Law, the compendiums, and so on and so on. But the issue was this long tail, which is a way of saying the possible questions that people might ask. And so people would come and surprisingly, they would ask a very generalized question like, this is what's going on in my life, and what would the church say to me here? We were not prepared for those kind of questions. And so we had to very quickly prioritize digitizing as much contextual analysis of church teaching as we can. And actually, one of the greatest sources we found for that was the homilies and general audiences of popes. Because essentially what they do is that, they look at, of course, they have immense access to church teaching, and usually they're looking at a very particular situation, and they distill down, right, into basically like a 20-minute address what the church fundamentally has to say about that point. And so for AIs, this is very helpful. What they need is lots of examples of generalization. You take the formal teaching, and then how do I abstract from that and apply it to a very particular situation? So that's why we embrace the ordinary magisterium. The other part of Magisterium AI is this Catholic theological and philosophical thought. And so this embraces not stuff that's magisterial, but let's say the doctors of the church, the church fathers, biblical commentary, and so on and so on. And of course, this has obvious benefits as well. I mean, Thomas speaks to a lot of subjects that the magisterium may not as in depth, and so having that knowledge and made available to users has obviously been, very helpful. Initially, the user would have to select whether they want to query magisterial or they want to query scholarly, which includes magisterial content as well. But with more recent advances in AI, because the AIs have been becoming more smarter and therefore are more capable of following instruction, we've actually been able to enter into kind of an auto mode, which is kind of the default now in Magisterium AI, where you ask a question and it will access the magisterial teaching and Catholic theological and philosophical thought, and based upon the user query, it will reference the material it thinks is most relevant to the query, and we felt that that's generally led to just better answers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things that I was thinking about back to my lectures at the Angelicum, and came across Melchior Cano and the idea of the sort of loci theologici, and the sort of the weight that is to be put upon the different parts of magisterial teaching. And this isn't something actually that the church has a full grasp on herself. I remember my professor there, Father Ralph Wyman, after I wrote a sort of a piece for a class there, and he said, you should do a doctorate on this because this needs more exploration. But that seems to me a really important part of what you would have had to do in designing this model, in teaching it. Well, this is a constitution of Vatican II. This is a motu proprio. This is off the cuff by Pope Francis on the sort of papal aeroplane. How have you sort of gone about sort of working out what significance to give to the different levels of teaching, and then how actually does the AI sort of take that on board whilst not ignoring the lower levels, which might have something profound to say?
Well, I mean, you're touching on what was a very, critical challenge for us. I mean, this whole process of working on this has been very humbling for me personally. I mean, before I started this company, I worked in the Office of Spiritual Affairs, and I sat basically at the end of a phone line where people would call us with doctrinal questions or complaints and things like that. And so, I felt like for years I had to reference the Catechism and Code of Canon Law, and I foolishly, I think I'd heard a pretty good spectrum of what was on people's minds, but man, was I totally wrong. Because with Magisterium AI, I came to see that there's a lot more questions on people's minds than I can possibly imagine, and that requires access to a lot more documents than I could have possibly imagined. And so one of the complexities was ensuring that when the AI answers, it's using the appropriate document to answer, right? And in principle, I mean, it should use the highest authority document, right? And so that required us to define the different levels of documents and the Catholic Church, council documents, and how those are different from encyclicals and how those are different from general audiences and things like that. And so for the most part, that took some work, obviously. And as you say, it is a very nebulous, kind of area. I mean, if, for instance, if you were to go, and I'm not encouraging you to do this because it won't work, but if you go and ask Magisterium AI to give me a list of all ex cathedra pronouncements, right? So those statements which have been declared, fully infallible, it won't do it because it's not entirely clear, right? And so now I'm not saying that hasn't been done, but we haven't found a work yet that has that kind of definitively laid out. If there is one, please someone write us in Magisterium AI, and we'll vectorize it, get that included right away. But we found that there's a number of issues like that, and so one of the good things is we could say these are the church levels of church documents that are out there. So AI, I want you to know that. And when someone asks you questions, when possible, try and use the document with the highest level of authority, and then work your way down. And for the most part, it's pretty good at that. But we still have challenges. I mean, it still wants to provide what it thinks is the most complete answer possible, so most precise answer possible. And sometimes that means that the document with the highest level of church authority may address the topic, but not as thoroughly, right, as, let's say, a homily or a general audience or an encyclical in the past. And so the AI will tend to want to use the encyclical because, frankly, it lays it out better. And so this is a bit of a challenge, but for the most part, because, this is one of the wonderful things about the Catholic Church and being Catholic is that church doctrine has been fundamentally consistent from the beginning, right? And so because of that, whether it uses a contemporary explanation or historic explanation, at least on core doctrinal issues, you're not going to see any inconsistencies. But what you may see is the way that teaching is articulated is a little bit different. And so it may not hit as well with a contemporary audience. But I think this is why, again, the Catholic Church is an edge. I think a lot of other faith groups, that would be a major struggle, is because the understanding of certain doctrines may not be as clear or evolved. For AIs, this presents a particular challenge.
Yeah. And then I noticed when I opened up Magisterium AI earlier today, amongst the search prompts that it had was write me a homily based on today's readings. How do you hope that priests might use that? And what would be your thought as a parishioner if a priest just read out a homily that he got from AI and you didn't know that he got it from AI, and then you found out later that what you thought was this fantastic homily, and you said, "Oh, that really helped me. That was so helpful, Father. It really, really spoke to me." And then he goes, "Well, actually, it was from AI."
I get this one a lot, and if I could make that suggestion prompt a little bit longer, I would say, I'm not saying that you should read this directly from the pulpit, but if you'd like help preparing a draft homily, please, submit your prompt here. But unfortunately, it's too wordy. But in principle, I mean, that's kind of the point. I mean, like, we know priests are exceptionally busy. And I think that when they come, especially in England, I think they're probably going to get busier and busier. And so, they don't have the time to go to the research, to go to the library and pull up books to prepare their homilies, for hours and hours and hours and hours at end. I wish they did, but I just, I don't think that's realistic. And so one of the reasons why, we built Magisterium AI is we felt it could be a resource for priests, if for no other reason. If they're writing a homily on a particular set of readings or on a particular topics, they can simply submit a prompt to Magisterium AI, and Magisterium AI will do the work of going through the stacks and pulling out all the documents which are relevant to answering that query and serving them up to the priest so that he can reference them in his homily. And I think that's just net is good for everybody, right? Because it means we'll hear from popes who wrote long ago, who may have really profound insights, who maybe the priests never learned about, right? But they existed; they had something to say to us. So, in that respect, I think it's very exciting. For the most part, when I speak to bishops' conferences about this, and they know this, but in large part, it just comes down to to training to the clergy. Is that when you ask Magisterium to write a homily, just recognize that that's going to be a draft, and that homily is going to be written at a very high level of abstraction. What I mean by that is, Magisterium AI has available very, magisterial teaching at the universal level for the most part. We're starting to introduce more particular knowledge, but it's very universal. And so if a homily is really going to be effective, it has to connect with the local community, which means that the priest has to understand the context, right? He has to understand where those parishioners are at, what are the particular challenges they're facing in their lives, right? He has to, and so if you just stay at the level of the church universals, it'll be profound, but I don't think it's going to hit as hard. And so, in order for the homily to really come together, I think you need to reference the universal teachings, but they need to find a way to make it particular. And a lot of times that means using anecdotes and things like that. And that's just something Magisterium AI is not going to be terribly effective at.
Yeah, and before people sort of panic too much, there are books full of homilies which priests buy in order to give themselves sort of helps. I regularly go to Peter Kreeft, who I love his collection of homilies, and also sort of John Bergsma for a more sort of an unpacking of the deeper meaning and the historical critical background to the scriptures. And then resources have existed, even St. Thomas Aquinas with his Catena Aurea, the golden chain. He produced a commentary of what all the church fathers had to say on various passages of scripture. So I think sometimes we can not actually realize how a new technology is just doing better what we've attempted to do in the past, and we can get a little bit sort of over panicked about it. And in fact, I've been receiving some messages from the leader of our English Catholic news program, and he said how he's used AI quite a lot, and he commented, I think the church mustn't be Luddite about AI. Rather than saying how can we keep lots of tedious jobs going so that people can feed their families, we need to say how can we free up people from tedious jobs and bring advances, for example, in medicine, and also help people feed their families. But then he mentions one sort of issue he had where he asked AI to give some information about the English and Wales bishops' recent meeting at Buckfast, and it wrote it as if Cardinal Nichols had actually been there rather than at the conclave in Rome. So I think from my perspective, AI is more useful the more that you know. A dangerous thing if you've not done the learning yourself, and you can't sort of trust the particular sort of AI model, but really, really helpful if you have started to do a bit of thinking yourself, and you have some reference point to check. Well, do I agree with what's being said here? One just final question before we run out of time. If people want to sort of learn more about how to use AI well in their lives, where they could be saving lots of time, and where would you advise them to look potentially for a tutorial on that? And also outside of sort of the very helpful sort of remit of Magisterium AI, amongst the different engines, like you mentioned ChatGPT and Gemini, is there one that you would recommend to our listeners in particular?
So, yeah, I mean, Gemini is a good one. I mean, I think, recently, I think Google's made some really important strides in reducing hallucinations, and they've been winning on benchmarks on that. And of course, now you can use features like deep research, which grounds what the LLM's saying and factual knowledge it finds online. So I think Gemini is great. And as I'm in England, the home of DeepMind, I felt honor bound to. But another one that I recommend is Perplexity. Perplexity AI is a great tool. It was built by guys who from academia, and what was kind of unique about Perplexity, especially when it first emerged, it's very similar to Magisterium AI, is everything that Perplexity says is grounded in a source, and so that's very helpful. And to the question about how do I learn more about how to use AI, how do I get access to good tutorial videos? This is going to sound but use AI. So go to Perplexity and tell it what you're looking for, and it will crawl the web for you, and it'll come back to you with an answer, instructions about what's the best approach to learning or to seeking out resources on this. And so I think I think many of us have just got used to going to Google with these kind of questions, and I think really what I would just suggest, instead of going to Google and just getting a bunch 10 blue links, try using an AI, which will give you an actual written answer, and then it will also give you links and citations and things like that. So I think that's probably the best advice I can give anyone is use AI.
Great. And just to give one answer from Magisterium AI to the sort of question that I posed you. So I said, how do you rank the different levels of church teaching? And I just give our listeners the opening paragraph, which I think was pretty good. The Catholic Church recognizes a hierarchy of truths where some doctrines are foundational and illuminate, and others illuminate. This hierarchy doesn't mean some truths are less important, but rather that some are based upon others. The Magisterium, the Church's teaching authority, exercises its authorities to the fullest when it defines dogmas which are truths contained in divine revelation or those having a necessary connection with them. And I wouldn't take too many issues with that. If I was marking an essay, I'd be like, well, this is off to a good start. So, Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. A great joy, and we thank you, and we ask that, God bless you abundantly in this work that you're seeking to do in the service of the church.
Thank you.